All right. So we're starting a little late, but we're starting. Someone else is coming. Oh dear, please. Everybody, you need to get here at 7 o'clock.
When the time comes.
Well, he has his own key. But we can wait just a second and see whether it's one more person. But please, I do want to try and start on time on the other days. We're on chapter 2, Mishnah 7. We're going to start talking about trees. All right, we can go ahead and put up a drawing of a tree because we're going to need that. Wait a minute. I have a green pen. Okay. Because we're going to be talking about all the parts of a tree. And they're coming. 3, 2, 1.
I can even look to the side to see who's.
Now they're having a chit chat outside.
And who said I should talk?
Yeah. Hello, Talmidim. Thanks. Okay, so we're talking about trees today. Trees are beautiful, but they have potential problems. Now leave it open. It's fresh air out there. So we don't need the air conditioners today. It's a nice night. And no offense to people who are on YouTube watching from colder places in the country. I'm sorry. But yes, we do have lovely weather here in Florida. You're welcome to come and visit and be in our classroom. Okay, so anybody here have a house with a tree? Okay. Oh, really? Only you?
Yeah.
No one else here has a house with a tree?
No,
with a tree. A tree in your house, in your backyard.
And the front of my house. I live in one apartment.
Oh, okay, right. But what's wrong with a tree? What could be the possible problem with a tree? Everybody loves trees.
In Florida, we know with hurricanes.
Okay, so a tree can fall down, right? We actually had a tree from our neighbor's yard that fell down from not a hurricane, but just another bad storm. And it pushed and trapped our garage door shut, and we had to get a little roof repair. So yeah, that can be a problem. But let's imagine the tree's not going to fall. The tree's just sitting there. It's not hurting anybody, right? Okay, so what are the potential problems of the tree? And then we're going to find out how the Mishnah solves them. So what are some possible problems?
It can block you from traveling with camels.
Okay, so one problem is how much room is there for me to walk underneath a tree, right? If the tree happens to be in a public area, if the tree has branches that are down to here, and this is the sidewalk, then now, I got to crawl underneath the tree. That would be a problem. Okay, so the height of the tree, the clearance of the tree could be a problem. You also mentioned the leaves, right? So there's things that fall out of trees, whether it be leaves, whether it be fruit, whether it be flowers. Those can often be problems, right? And imagine, for many of these cases, imagine the tree is on my property, but part of the tree is over your property. Right? If you've ever talked to people who have a neighbor's tree that reaches into their yard and it's dropping leaves in their swimming pool, not always a happy conversation, right? What else can the tree cause trouble? Well, we're going to find out in the Mishnah what rights you've got. Right? Under American law, when we get there, our real estate agent can fill us in. But for Mishnah law, we'll find out what that does.
If an animal dies, it can transmit impurity.
Oh, okay. So this is a uniquely Jewish question, which is if I've got a dead animal, right? That's its tail. If I've got a dead animal, right, or a dead person for that matter, then the tree becomes an ohel. It becomes a tent that allows the impurity of the animal to be transferred to anything underneath the canopy, right? So therefore, this could be a problem that would cause ritual impurity to someone else or someone else's property. The roots Yerach mentioned, right? These lovely little roots that I drew. Roots are wonderful until they're pushing up your sidewalk, or until they're getting in the way of where your plow is going, or if they're hitting your cistern. Remember the water holder container, the tank.
Infrastructure of the house.
Right.
Yes, the structure of the house.
Exactly. You can hit the foundation. The roots. Well, roots are strong, and they will go through rock.
He broke in the pool.
They can break into a pool, right? Exactly. So all of these pieces of a tree can cause trouble. And back then in the ancient world, trees were not just decorative. Trees were also important. Right? You had trees, yes, for shade, and you had trees, yes, for wood, but you also had trees often for fruit. And the fruit was not just like, oh, look, I have oranges in my yard. I need the fruit. Right? The olive trees and the carob trees and the other trees were very, very important for the economy of Israel. So you can't just say no trees. You have to learn how to work this out. So we're going to talk a lot about trees today, a few other items as well. But I just want to make sure we understood the potential problems of the tree so that we can see the solutions that the Mishnah is going to be offering us. Okay, so we are on chapter 2, Mishnah 7, and we're going to talk about trees near the city, near the public domain. And Aaron, you don't mind starting?
Yeah. A tree may not be grown within a distance of 25 cubits from the town, or 50 cubits if it is a carob tree or a sycamore tree.
Okay, so 25 cubits is, what is that, like 40 something feet? 25 is 25 times 1.5. So it's, not exactly close, not exactly far, but it's also a little bit of a distance away from the city. Now, this was because trees could become a problem to the city. They're blocking up the edge of the city. So they need this empty zone around the outskirts of a city. Now, carob and sycamore tree had a much wider canopy, right? Their branches went out much, much further. And that's why they're given the 50 cubit distance.
Is this measured from the trunk?
Yes. Yeah, this is from trunk to city wall or city boundary. Exactly. That's why, otherwise you would just say, if you're always measuring from the canopy, then you wouldn't need to make anything bigger for carob and sycamore. And of course, you don't plant a tree with a canopy. You plant a tree with a little stick, the sapling. And so you measure from where you're planting the tree. So you have to imagine someone's going out and they're going to plant trees in their property outside the city. Remember, we talked before about how people lived in the city and then went out to their fields. Right, so some guy wants to plant in his field, which is just outside the city, and he puts down the sapling, and the city people go, wait a minute, that's too close. They can actually force him to cut down the tree or move it if it's too close. We good? Onward.
Abba Shaul says, any tree that bears no fruit may not be grown within a distance of 50 cubits.
Right, so Abba Shaul was a little stricter. He said all non-fruit trees, not just carob and sycamore, although carob is technically a fruit tree, should be grown further away from the city because they're not really a benefit. Right? I understand economically, if it's a fruit tree, you want it closer, and that's your property. You need to maximize its use. But if it's not a fruit tree, then it should be even further away, because they want this clear space around the town. But now the question becomes, which came first?
If the town was there first, the tree shall be cut down and no compensation given. If the tree was there first, it shall be cut down and compensation given.
I go ahead with the doubt.
If it is in doubt which was there first, the tree shall be cut down and no compensation given.
Okay.
Compensation for who?
The owner of the tree.
But if it's in the public domain,
Hmm?
what if it's a tree in the public domain that from no one?
If it's just a wild tree, then you cut it down.
Oh.
Yeah, just if it's just a random tree. But in outside of forests in Israel, trees didn't just grow on trees. Trees didn't just grow everywhere because the environment was not like Florida. In Florida, if you go away for 5 years and come back, there'll be trees all over your property. In Israel, you have to work to make trees. So unless you're near a forest, the trees are constantly being grown by the forest. But if you're just in a random part, you're not going to get so many big trees just growing up, suddenly. So what they're saying is, if the tree is planted and the city is then established, or the city then grows into where the edge of the tree is, then if the tree was there first, then the tree would be cut down, and you'd have to pay for it. Right? If so let's imagine, you've got your tree, and you got the town, right? And the town grows until it's close enough to the tree, right? Then they say, okay, we're going to cut down the tree, but here's your money. Here's the money for the cost of the tree. And the judge would have to find out what that cost was. But if the city was already there, and then you planted your tree, the city can say, get your tree out of here. right? You're not allowed to plant there. And they can force you to remove it, cut it down, and they don't have to pay you anything. The question becomes, what happens if no one's 100% sure which came first, the tree or the city? And the answer the Mishnah gives us is, you cut it down and you don't pay. Right? Just get your axe and cut it down. So you want to have witnesses and understanding, and people know this tree has been on my land long before the city reached this point, and therefore, you're not allowed to just cut it down without compensating me. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
This compared to the one with the two shops where one was above the other and the
Mhm.
smelling. So obviously this one, the burden's on the plaintiff, the
tree owner.
money,
The tree owner.
right? Because that's what it's the burden's on the plaintiff. That's just the general rule, right? And the other one you're asking for injunctive relief. So when you're asking for an injunctive relief,
Mm-hmm.
how do they decide who the burden's on?
So I'm not as familiar with the American legal terms.
Sorry.
So injunctive relief means,
You're asking somebody to stop doing something.
okay. So in terms of, well, who should or shouldn't have been there first?
Well, who has the burden of proving who was there first? An injunctive relief, which basically means stop doing this,
Right.
versus monetary relief means damages.
So I'm not entirely sure that the distinction is 100% the same in maybe the Jewish law, but the burden of proof in this case is different because this case is not an individual versus an individual. This is the town versus the individual, and the town has almost like an eminent domain right to clear away from its borders. So the town actually has precedent in this case. That's going to actually come back in a later Mishnah where we see person versus person, and the law is a little bit different. But here, when it's the person versus the town is the one that is given the benefit of the doubt.
Right, but I thought,
Even though normally the town in this position would be, as an individual, would be in a weaker position.
sure, but that's, all right, this is my understanding. Because that's a question of, whether or not the tree has to go down is a question of law. Whether or not you get paid money is going to be a question of fact. What was there first, the town or the tree? So that's where the burden of proof.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, questions of law and questions of fact.
Mhm.
So who is there first would be a question of fact, and the burn's on the person asking for the money. Back to the two-floor thing, I forget what they were doing. But who was there first is going to be a question of fact, but the law is obviously already set in proof.
Well, it depends. There were certain laws, to use the terminology you're using. There were certain laws about who could be where in different zoning laws,
Right.
of upper and lower apartments and all of that, and the distance with stoves and things like that. So there were laws that were, if you're doing it, you're violating it. It doesn't matter whether you were here first or not. You shouldn't be doing that. Anyone else? No? Okay.
Are you looking at one crowd?
Okay. Maybe it's the security guard.
Oh.
So that would be perhaps more parallel to what you're talking about.
Sure, but if there is a question of who was there first, because who was ever there second has to
If both
stop.
have the right to be there, and neither one has the preferential right to force the other person to stop, then it doesn't. Then it goes to the court for more details.
So it's by preferential rights, like
Well, So, for example, we had a discussion about the person doing their trade, making spoons in their marketplace, making spoons in the courtyard of the apartment building.
but that had nothing to do with who was there first, though, right?
Well, that's the thing. Even if the person doesn't like you making spoons, you're allowed to make spoons, right? It's just simply allowed. Likewise, you're not allowed to open up a spoon shop in the courtyard. Right? If you want to sell your spoons, you got to go to the marketplace. You can't do it here. Now, if everyone agrees you can do it here, that's fine. But if a new person moves in and says, I don't like you selling spoons in the courtyard, that person has the right to shut down the spoon shop because it is the right of a person in the courtyard to not be not be annoyed by the commerce of his neighbors.
Right.
You have the right to shut them down, even if he had been enjoying that privilege prior, because it is your right to enjoy the peace and quiet relative to your courtyard. You have the right to stop him when you move in.
I think it was like the bakery, though, and the dye shop, who's ever there first gets to stay, right?
We'll review that later. Let's go ahead and continue with the Mishnah here in this part. All right. So now, Mishnah 8. A little bit more drawing. Okay. Nowadays, you guys, when you want to do baking, you go to the supermarket and you buy flour, right? And when you buy your flour, it comes in a lovely bag, right? Of, flour, and it usually has pictures on the front of the wheat, and it's lovely and nice. And you open it up, and all the flour is like pure white inside, right? That doesn't happen easily. Getting flour to look like that is a lot of work. And in the ancient world, of course, it didn't come in a bag. It was growing in the field, right? All your wheat was out growing in the field. And for all of this, inside each piece were tiny, tiny little seeds, the tiny little seeds of wheat. Right? That's what wheat is. And if you want to get the wheat, you have to break open the growing stalks after you've cut them down and take the seed out and get rid of all of the extra waste, all the chaff. Exactly. Now, the word is used as the chaff. Now, you can do that by sitting on the ground and breaking open each piece and putting the seed over here and putting the chaff over here, and then break open another one, put the seed over, and you'll starve to death. Right? That just doesn't work. So instead, you do what's called threshing. And threshing has lots of different ways that it was done in the ancient world, but it basically meant you would hit the wheat over and over, and it would break it open, and then you'd throw it up in the air, and the seeds were heavy and they would fall, and the chaff would blow away in the wind, right? So that was how you would sort between the stuff you wanted and the stuff you didn't want. You let the wind clean it off. And yeah, you might lose a seed or two, but the main system worked pretty well. All right, so everyone has that image, right? So a threshing floor is the area where you do the breaking and the scattering. And that's a messy business. So we got the picture? All right. Ready?
A permanent threshing floor may not be made within 50 cubits of the town.
Okay, so again, just like our trees, we want these to be further away from the town. Now, permanent threshing floor. Temporary, seasonal, that was fine, but to have it in the same place all the time for every year, every harvest, every threshing, that was not allowed within 50 cubits of the town. Okay, so what's the problem? Right? Why do we not want a permanent threshing floor near the town? Yeah, because you're going to have all these pieces flying in the wind right into my house. Remember, 50 cubits is like 75 feet. That's like from one end of the synagogue to the other, right? And with the wind blowing everything, my house, my courtyard, remember, they don't have beautiful glass windows. It's just going to be blowing right into my living room. They only had one room, but it would be a horrible mess and nasty, and breathing all these little pieces in the air. It's, if you've ever worked around plants, like really farm work, it's not great. It's not a great atmosphere. So that was what they were trying to prevent. This is essentially pollution legislation. They are saying in modern world, we would say you need to keep your smokestacks of your factory a certain distance away from the town, because the particles in what you make are going to be causing too much trouble for the people in the city. So this is very early pollution legislation, right? This is the EPA for the Mishnah. You understand? Onward.
One may not make a permanent threshing floor within his own domain unless his ground extended 50 cubits in every direction.
All right. So even in your own property, even away from the city, you need 50 cubits around your permanent spot for your threshing, so that your stuff is not falling always on someone else's property. Now, why is permanent so important here? What happens with a permanent threshing floor that's different than one that I use? This year I'm in this field, this year I'm in this field, this year I'm in this field. What the permanent one means, I'm in the same spot every year.
Whoever is closer to you gets it every year.
Not just whoever, but that spot in the land is going to get everything always. Right? If I spread it around, one year I'm in this field, one year I'm in that field, then where my shaft goes is going to be spread around. But if it's in the same spot and the wind is always blowing, it's always going to be ending up in the same place, and that's going to ruin some patch of land. And if I spread it around, it's not so bad. But if I have it focused on one piece always, and it's not my property, then I'm damaging that person's property. I am polluting, right? I am offloading the externality. I'm offloading the costs of the damages of what my industry is creating to someone else, right? I get to benefit from the wheat. Someone else has to pay for the damage of the chaff. And that, the Mishnah says, is wrong. You're not allowed to push the cost to someone else so that you don't have to pick up the bill. Now, if you go out in the middle of nowhere to a random hill that doesn't belong to anyone, that's perfectly fine. And indeed, that was a common thing. Many of the villages in the ancient world would have, up on a hill where it was very windy, they would have threshing floors that everyone in the town would use. And that way it would just blow away in the wind. It wasn't going to one person's property. It was just public use and no one would get hurt. That was a common solution.
Wouldn't you want the public threshing floor in the valley, not a hill?
Wind doesn't work like that, right? Because you need enough wind so that when you throw it in the air, the chaff leaves and doesn't just fall right back down again, or else you didn't sort anything. So you need a breeze, and so hills were used. All right, good. Part A.
And he must distance it from his fellow's plant and plowed land.
Plowed.
What is it?
Plowed.
Plowed land so that it will not cause damage.
Yeah, OUGH is terrible in English. So this is telling us that even if it's more than 50 cubits, if there's a constant strong wind, that your chaff is going to end up in his plowed land, right, or that will be on his plants, then you're going to be damaging his property, and therefore you have to stop. And again, this is what many people look at in the modern Jewish readings. They'll say, well, this applies then for other types of pollution. A factory that has water pollution or air pollution or ground pollution, you have to make sure that your industry is not causing damage to someone else, and that you're causing them to pick up the price for what you're making. You're not allowed to outsource these costs. Make sense? Good. So whenever people say, oh, the Mishnah, it's all old, what was it? This is still relevant today. I mean, yeah, we're not farmers and we're not, throwing our wheat in the air, but the same issue still comes up day in, day out. And this is something that is still very relevant, not only for your neighbors and you, but for whole giant industries. Still are, in our opinion, should still be following these types of limitations. All right, Yerach, same page at the bottom, Mishnah 9.
Okay, Mishnah 9. Animal carcasses, graves, and tanneries must be distanced 50 cubits from the town.
So animal carcasses, you're out, cutting up the bodies of animals for the meat or for leather. Yeah, I know, it's not pretty, right? Or a grave where you're burying the dead people, or the tanneries. Tanneries where you take the skin of animals and you make it into leather. And it is a very nasty process to turn skin into leather, right? To get rid of all the hair and to stretch it and make it so that the skin won't rot, so that it stays good. That's a very, very hard, very smelly process.
So 50 amount like 40 meters.
It's
40
about
feet.
75 feet. 75 feet.
We say that 50 amount 75.
Right. 50 is about 75 feet. So 75 feet is about 25 meters.
Yeah, it's nothing.
Nowadays, yeah. Right. But remember, we're talking here about like personal industry. It's not like a tannery that has 5,000 workers, right? This is, a guy and his family making leather. That was, their family job. So yes, if you scale this up, if you have a tannery that's much, much bigger, then they have the right to have further restrictions on how close you can get. This is talking about a typical case in their generation.
I remember when I was a kid, when I used to go to my aunt in Netanya, and there was a tannery like this on the way from the bus to the house. Smell,
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. It's a horrible process to make leather. But absolutely essential in the ancient world, especially to have leather. I mean, leather was very needed, very necessary. But that doesn't mean that you making leather should make everyone else suffer. Right? So absolutely, they're not saying no one's allowed to have a tannery. They're just saying you have to put it a certain distance. And there's one additional thing about tannery that they're going to add in. And this is very fitting because you've actually been there. Maybe you could even guess why this is the case.
A tannery may be set up only to the east of the town.
Okay, so why?
Because the wind
Exactly.
direction.
Exactly, because of the wind. In Israel, most of the winds on average are from west to east, right? Blowing in from the Mediterranean Ocean, and because of the rotation of the earth. So that's the general blow of the wind. So if the tannery, if you have your, this is north up here. If you have your town and you put a tannery here, then all the smell is going right into the town because this is the general direction of the wind. But if you put a tannery over here, then the wind is blowing the smell away from town. So that way we don't have to suffer with the smell that's there.
Rabbi,
Yes.
is this like the tree? If the town's there first, then he has to move his tannery with no compensation. If the
Yes.
tannery's there first, the town has to compensate him.
Yes. So if the town grows up and the tannery is now too close to the town, then the town can force him to move, but they would have to pay him a compensation. Which, by the way, I should point out is similar to, at least in most states, the law of eminent domain in America, which is if you build illegally, the government can destroy whatever you built and take over that area. But if it's your property and you've built legally and the government needs it, the government has to compensate you before it still can take it from you. Like, when they're building a freeway, they can take your property, but they have to pay you the value of that property. Right. More or less. Right. My grandparents had a big fight with the government over when the government was building a freeway and took their house. And it was not pretty because you don't always feel the government's giving you the fair price because, the government doesn't have to go on the free market. The government can pay you what it thinks is valuable. Okay. Rabbi Akiva, however, has a different opinion.
Okay. Rabbi Akiva says it may be set up on any side save the west, and it must be distanced 50 cubits from the town.
Okay, so there's two ways to understand Rabbi Akiva. There's within the Mishnah itself, it seems like Rabbi Akiva is saying if you put a tannery here, if you put a tannery there, it's all good because the wind is blowing that way and it's not going to bother the town. However, there is a explanation that's given by the Talmud that says actually what Rabbi Akiva is worried about is the Shekhinah. Is that he feels that the Shekhinah, that God's presence, is more in the west than the east, and therefore you shouldn't build a tannery in the direction of God's Shekhinah.
Why?
Hmm?
Why is Shekhinah more on the west than the east?
It's a great question. And the idea there is, generally speaking, seen in Lachadodi nowadays. At the end of Lachadodi, if you're in a synagogue that has a direction facing to the east, and you are welcoming Shabbat into your midst, which direction do you turn? You turn to the entrance, which is west.
Yes, because the ark is in the east.
Exactly. And so you turn to the west to welcome Shabbat, to welcome the Shekhinah with Shabbat, because the Shekhinah is coming as from the westwardly direction as the day begins.
But that's because the building is like you're supposed to pray in the direction of the east. So the opposite sides for the Aaronic Kodesh, of course, is the door.
No, not exactly. There's a reason. So yes, there's lots of variables here. So you're right. Nowadays, in modern synagogue construction, ideally, if the geography lets you, you build the synagogue pointing towards Jerusalem, right? And if you're in anywhere from Israel through to the United States, that means the synagogue is going to be facing to the east.
If not, it's facing to the west.
And if you live in, Afghanistan, in China, India, it's going to be facing to the west.
Okay.
However, there is an older model of how this works. that has to do with the temple of Jerusalem, right? How was the temple of Jerusalem oriented? Where would I put my compass? If this is Jerusalem and this is the front of the temple, where do I put north?
On the top.
And the top, exactly, right? Right. This is the north. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can see that the Temple Mount is shaped like that, right? It's a rectangle that's longer north to south and narrower east to west, right? Where is the Holy of Holies? The east side of the temple or the west?
East. What's in the east?
West. Wow.
This is the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is in the westernmost part of the temple. So there was a feeling that the west was considered to be the most sacred. Maybe a little bit of a digression, but when people talk about the Western Wall, there's actually two different Western walls that were being talked about. Originally in the Talmud, when it talks about the Western Wall being the holiest wall of the temple, it was talking about this wall of the temple. However, this wall of the temple ain't there anymore, right? The Romans destroyed it. I'm very happy about that still. So when the Romans destroyed that, the motto about the Western Wall being holy was transferred to the actual kotel, the wall that we go to now, which is not a wall of the temple, but a wall of the retaining wall, the construction wall that held up the flat area, the plaza above. So if you've ever wondered, why did people go to the Western Wall? Why not go to the Southern Wall? Why not go to the Northern Wall? Why not go to the Eastern Wall? It's because there was this idea that the Western Wall of the temple was holier, and therefore that got transferred to the actual Western retaining wall, and this area was the part that was exposed. And that was because of the idea that the Holy of Holies was in the West, and that became part of the overall mystique of the Shekhinah being westwardly. And therefore, you wouldn't want to put something as horrible as a tannery in the Shekhinah's direction. So it's an interesting twist that Rabbi Akiva came up with. However, he loses the halakha battle. Right? The halakha eventually follows the first one, what we call the Tanakama, the primary teaching, which is it's only, I erased my other one, it's only on the east that you're allowed to put a tannery.
Question.
Who was
If
first?
you go ahead.
If you were first, then he has to compensate you. But if he was first, you cut him down, and then you.
But if Rabbi Akiva say that you... Oh, no, nothing.
Nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
How come? Well, I understand why. Our Aron Kodesh here in Temple Israel was facing west also,
Yes.
not what the normal way should face.
Not towards the ideal. Correct.
Yeah, the idea. Is it because
It's-
that's how the building was?
It's because we bought the building
No choice.
secondhand. Yes.
No choice.
Yeah. The way the building was built and its orientation to the street meant that it was natural to put the focus of the building in the middle of the building, which means westwardly. So when we took over the building, we didn't have, the option of doing all of the massive reconstruction that would be needed to move the focus of the building to the other end.
Technically, it's okay because
Yes.
yeah, because you're facing east or you're facing west, it's always towards Jerusalem.
Yes, but even more than that, if you were on a boat in the middle of the ocean and there was no compass and no cloud, does that mean you don't pray?
You pray.
Of course. And how do you find Jerusalem?
Well, today we have GPS, but
Imagine you've got no tools.
like the sun.
You find Jerusalem here,
Oh, okay.
right? Which means you focus. This is the halakha, right? If you don't know which direction Jerusalem is, you turn to a direction and you focus your heart towards Jerusalem and you daven and you pray, right? So yes, no matter which direction we face, we can face Jerusalem in our heart. Now, we still do have a very strong preference when we're building a building and we have choice of building it so that we can do that with the compass and with the GPS and pointing ourselves towards Jerusalem. But one little extra wrinkle on the whole Jerusalem issue for geography nerds is most people, when they build their synagogue, even if they have 100% choice, right, a big empty land that doesn't matter where the street is, they still build it wrong when facing towards Jerusalem. Because if you get out your map and you lay it down and you say, here's my city, here's Jerusalem, so we're going to go 5 degrees and angle it towards Jerusalem, that's actually wrong, because the world isn't flat. Sorry, the world's not flat. The world's a globe. If you want to get to Jerusalem the fastest way possible, if you want to get to Jerusalem the most direct way possible, there's something what's known as the Great Circle, which is because of the curve of the planet, the shortest distance between here and Jerusalem actually goes up and over. That's what airplanes do all the time, because they're not going to fly the long way. They want to fly the shortest route. So there's actually a little bit of an arc that would take you to Jerusalem. So even though Jerusalem is technically this way, if I had a laser, if I'm actually trying to get to Jerusalem faster, I need to go this way. And I'll still travel in a straight line-ish because of the way the curve goes, but that would be technically the shortest distance between me and Jerusalem. So really, there's no synagogue that is best towards Jerusalem. The important thing isn't the geography. The important thing is, how are you lining up your heart? And if you're willing to line up your heart, then it can be in any direction. But it still is, I think, good for the tradition to put it on the eastern side, if that's where you are, if not in China or India. We just, need to sometimes recognize that the geography doesn't always let us do that, or the building that we buy doesn't let us do that sometimes.
So we consider we are so tzaddikim that we pray in the direction of the Shekhinah.
Exactly. So no matter which way you're standing, you can always find Jerusalem if you want. And no matter which way you're standing, you can ignore Jerusalem if you want. Right? I mean, how many tourists, have you seen that go to Jerusalem and they're looking at their phone rather than looking at the city? So it's you can ignore Jerusalem even when you're standing in it. And you can find Jerusalem even if you're 5,000 miles away. All right. Mishnah 10. I believe, Natan, it's your turn.
One place is steeping pond far from vegetables and leaks from onions and mustard from leeks.
Okay. Steeping pool. A pool for soaking flax is the translation that ours gives, because it's a little bit more clear. So flax is what you make linen out of. Do you know linen, the cloth, the fabric? So flax is the plant that you grow, because linen comes from a plant, not from an animal. And you grow it, and then you have to let it soak. And when you let it soak in these special like water channels, it's nasty, right? The water gets very toxic from the chemicals basically inside the flax that are being pulled out to make it into this lovely soft fabric linen that will turn into thread, which is, linen is impossible to iron, but it gets very wrinkly. But that is why they don't want it to be near vegetables, because between the fumes and the water going through the earth, it's going to damage other people's plants. So you need to keep it far enough away. This is like a chemical damage that they're worried about here. Now, this is your Clean Water Act that we're talking about in this case. Now,
they don't specify distance. They just
any distance necessary to keep it safe. Right. So if you have a giant pool, you're going to have to put it further away. If you have a smaller pool, it can be closer. So this is very much dependent upon the damage that might be done. Now, leeks from onions, apparently, and I do not know if this is biologically true, but there was a belief that if you grew onions near, if you grew leeks near onions, the onions would lose their pungency. They wouldn't be as strong, as good, as potent. And so therefore your leeks were hurting my onions. Now, I've never grown leeks. I've grown onions, but I've never grown leeks. I love leeks. But I don't know whether or not leeks near onions really do cause damage. But apparently they thought that they caused damage in the ancient world. And so they needed to be separate to make sure the onions weren't hurt. The mustard plants and bees. All right, back to our biology class. How do bees make honey?
drinking the juice
Right.
from the flowers.
They get the nectar from every
Nectar.
flower. And if you've ever gone to like a farmer's market, they'll have all sorts of fancy types of honey,
Yeah.
right? Clover honey and wildflower honey
Wildflower,
and
yeah.
blah, 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 blah honey. Orange tree honey you'll find here in Florida, right? Depending upon the plant that the bee is eating will change the honey, the taste of the honey,
Or the look even.
and also the look.
Make it delicate, yeah.
Right. So the issue with mustard was that apparently it made the honey worse. And so if my mustard plant is near your beehive, then your bees are going to be coming to my mustard and they're going to go back and they're going to make mustardy honey. And that's going to be worse.
It's sweet and sour.
Sweet and sour, exactly. So keep your mustard away from my bees. Right, now, again, this is the question of, well, who's there first? Now that question I'm going to put on hold until Mishnah 11. I think it's Mishnah 11, which goes into that question a little bit more detail of who's causing damage, and am I causing potential for damage, or am I actually causing damage? Right? Because there's not necessarily automatically, and that's what Rabbi Yossi is trying to say. In the second part.
No, but before that.
Okay. Well, let's do part A. Let's do Rabbi Yossi.
Yossi permits mustard.
Right. He said it's fine because the mustard plant isn't harming anything yet. Right. There's a possibility it might hurt, but it's not damaging today, and therefore you can't go ahead and make me move it or stop it. So once it's there, it's there. Now that position, like I said, we're going to get into more of the debate in Mishnah 11.
Who won? Yossi lost.
So I'm trying to remember because he does win on some of these. I just want to remember which one he does. No, I think he actually does win on this one.
Does he? I thought the anonymous Mishnah
Hold on.
always wins.
Usually there are extenuating circumstances. If you give me a second, I can check my notes.
And what usually was?
Usually the anonymous Mishnah wins.
Yes.
No, the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. Yep. In both this case,
Rabbi Yossi.
yeah, Rabbi Yossi, on yours as well. Okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
in my notes, I double checked, and yeah, halacha follows Rabbi Yossi, and also in the next Mishnah as well. But Natan, you said you had another question.
No, that. Not only with that, like for example, I don't know, like living in woods,
Mm-hmm.
I think was cotton with different colors that initially they produced.
Cotton? I don't know. I've never grown cotton.
Yeah, I think it was cotton, I think, if I remember correctly. I can't remember now, different colors, natural colors.
Okay,
And
cool.
they keep them very far from each other.
Right.
Because the bees, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
They don't want it to contaminate the colors.
Right. Because if the bees are interfering, or if they're pollinating from one to the other, then they're making a hybrid that won't have the pure color they want. Yeah. Yep. So you can imagine if your neighbor. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So you can imagine if your neighbors across the wall is doing something that will damage your produce, that can be a big problem.
Rabbi,
Yes.
Kehati,
Yes.
he says they don't specify the distance,
Right.
but Tosafot,
Right.
he says it's 50.
Right. So 50 would be the average, but
Yeah.
the different readings that I saw said 50 would be the average. That's sort of our benchmark. But if there is reason to believe that would still cause damage, then it can be moved further. Exactly.
Interesting.
Okay. Mishnah 11. Aaron, we're back to you. Back to trees.
A tree may not be grown within 25 cubits of a cistern or within 50 cubits if it is a cherry or sycamore, whether it is higher or on the same level.
Okay. So first of all, let me just draw flat, and then we'll draw on the hill. So we're going to go sideways. All right, I've got my cistern, my water tank, my swimming pool, and then we've got the tree. What's the problem here?
Could break the cistern.
How?
Roots.
Roots, exactly. The main worry
Yeah.
are the roots that are going to go through the wall. There is some concern about things maybe dropping into the cistern, but the main worry is the roots, because many cisterns were mostly closed, maybe with a little hole at the top. But the main issue are the roots. So they need to be at least 25 cubits away, 50 for sycamore or carob, because sycamore and carob have bigger roots. Excuse me, I don't know if you've ever seen a big sycamore tree. They're beautiful, but they're huge. They really grow wide. They don't just grow up. And they grow with very wide root systems as well.
And carob, how you use carob?
I've never seen a carob tree. I've eaten carob, but I've never seen a carob tree.
You have to go to Israel.
I know. They're much more common in the Middle East than they are in America. Yeah, carob is what we had before we discovered chocolate. And then once you discovered chocolate, nobody wanted carob anymore. That's not true. Some people still like carob, and God bless them. But yeah, carob compared to chocolate, I haven't found anybody yet who will pick carob over chocolate. Okay, now, we're also talking about a hill, right? What happens if, right, we got a picture? Thank God for Google, right? Let's see.
Yeah, that carob tree.
Yep, see, very wide.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so the question here is, if you're on a hill, then you might think that, okay, up here, the roots are going to cause a problem, but down here, the roots wouldn't cause a problem. You might think that I'm safe if I'm below the cistern. But as we just saw, the halacha is that whether it's on the higher or on the same level, it's not allowed. Sorry, it's not allowed. But actually, if I'm not mistaken, my brain is just now remembering again. Yes, if it's lower, then it was allowed because of that exact reason. Right, the lower tree below the cistern was not likely to cause the cistern because its roots were not going to go upward to penetrate.
The sycamore is beautiful.
Isn't it? I told you. It's our botany class.
So it can be lower but not higher?
Yep, and not on the same level.
Windows.
Let me see your picture.
Nice, beautiful.
Yeah. Sycamores are still grown for decorative purposes all over the U.S.
Do they have them in Israel?
I don't know.
They must, though, we wouldn't have this.
Yeah, well, yay, Yesher koach. Right, they wouldn't be talking about sycamore trees if they didn't have sycamore trees, which actually brings up a good point, which is, do you think the halacha only applies to sycamore and carob trees? No, it applies to any trees that are like sycamore and carob. For example, in California, we have something called a bay fig tree. And the bay fig tree is a huge canopy and giant roots that are above ground even. And it's a type of fig tree. And absolutely, they will destroy anything nearby. And the fruit they drop stains everything and nothing grows underneath them. So you would have the same kind of rule of you keep your bay fig away from my property.
In my yard, in New York,
Mhm.
I have one big one.
Yeah.
Every day I take it.
Yep.
I give it to my wife.
A lot of figs? Yeah, figs are amazing.
So the roots are always go down, never up.
Well, unless you're like, what do you call them? The cypress trees out here in the swamp that come back up to breathe.
No, I mean for there. Like
Yeah.
if you're in a mountain, always go down.
Well, roots go down from the tree, right? They're not likely to climb up the hill. Gravity. All right. Part 2. I believe we're still on you, Aaron.
Yes. If the cistern was there first, the tree shall be cut down and compensation given.
But A.
If the tree was there first, it shall not be cut down.
Okay, so now, unlike our discussion of the city, now it really does come down to who was there first. Right?
No, but in the city, you cut anyway.
Exactly.
So
That's why I said this is different than the
Yeah.
city.
Oh, okay.
Right? In this one, if I planted my tree and then you dig a cistern, you can't make me cut down my tree. Right? My tree was already there. You can build a cistern, but you can't make me cut down my tree because you knew my tree was there when you dug your cistern.
Or also, what to emphasize, the public domain is much stronger because you have more internet and private.
Exactly. You have the public interest, not just an individual's interest. And on the opposite side, if the cistern was there first, and then I plant down my tree, cut it down, and I don't have to pay you for cutting it down. Sorry, I do have to pay you for cutting it down. right? The compensation is given. That's why you'd always double check these things, right? You do have to pay for the value of the tree because it is your property. Technically, you would normally be allowed to use it, but because your tree is now a potential hazard to my cistern, it has to be, I can ask that it be removed as long as I'm willing to pay. If I'm not willing to pay, you don't have to cut anything down. Does that make sense? Right?
It's
So
still a little similar to the city.
it's a little similar in the sense that their compensation,
Both need to cut down.
they can be cut down. The cistern owner could say, I don't mind, right? The city doesn't say that because the city has to think about everyone, and therefore they keep that ring of empty space around it. But for this, the compensation is given. There was in the city case, sometimes it was cut down and no compensation was given, right? If the tree was planted after the city was there, they could cut it down and not pay a thing. The tree is planted after the cistern, but there still needs to be compensation if it's cut down.
How come it's not the guy's fault for planting a cistern so close to the tree?
Well, it is his fault, but it's not damaging to the tree, right? So yeah, he's now made himself vulnerable. If I dig my cistern after your tree is already there, I've made my cistern vulnerable to what your roots might possibly do.
I meant the other way around.
Oh, okay.
I mean, how come he has to, if his cistern was there first, how come he has to compensate the person for planting the tree when he should not have planted the tree there?
Because the tree is still on his property, right? So there is still this idea that it is my property, and therefore my fair use of my property is to grow trees on it.
Right.
However, because there is the potential harm here, you can force me to move my tree, but you have to compensate me for that.
How come it's fair use if,
Now, hold on, let me back up and just give you maybe the difference here. If it was harming you, then there wouldn't be an issue here. I'd be paying you for damages. If I plant my tree and it destroys your cistern, then not only do you destroy my tree, but I, the tree owner, have to pay you for the damage I've done to you. So there is a worst case scenario, which is the tree is actually causing damage. Here, the tree is in potential for causing damage. And that's, in fact, what Rabbi Yossi is going to be talking about in just a minute. So maybe let's finish up the Mishnah, and then we'll talk about Rabbi Yossi's opinion, and then it'll hopefully make a little more sense.
if it is in doubt which was there first, the tree shall not be cut down.
Right? So again, the tree is on my property, and therefore, if there's a question, you're asking me to suffer a financial loss. You're asking me to lose my tree, whereas you are only maybe going to have a damaged cistern. So therefore, if you can't prove that my tree was here second, I don't need to remove my tree. And this goes back to that principle we've talked about off and on, that the person who's coming demanding the change, demanding the payment, demanding damages, they have the burden of proof if there isn't already clear evidence. Okay, so that handles the general case. Rabbi Yossi has a different opinion. Now, like I said, the halacha is going to follow Rabbi Yossi, so pay attention.
Even if the cistern was there before the tree, it should not be cut down, since this one dug within his own domain and the other planted within his own domain.
Okay, so Rabbi Yossi is saying, no, yeah, but no, right? He is saying it's your property, it's his property, you planted, he planted. Therefore, if there isn't damage happening today, right, then therefore it should not be paid for, there should not be any consequence yet, right? I'm not actually doing something yet.
He's a realist.
Well, he's a realist, but he's also, like I said, I think it was last week, the Mishnah is reluctant to take money or property from somebody unnecessarily. And what we have here is a potential hazard. What we have here is a potential inconvenience. The other cases we've looked at was where there was a imminent problem or an imminent or a real damage or real inconvenience. You know, if you've got your tannery, that's not maybe going to smell. That will smell. Right? That is what tanneries do. This tree maybe will go into the cistern, or maybe not. We don't know yet. And since it's on your property and my property, you both have free use. until there is a problem. Once there's a problem, then all the damage rules kick in, and then we'll handle it from there. So Rabbi Yossi, and like I said, the halakha does eventually follow him, basically says, yes, there is room for you to plant your tree and me to dig my cistern, and if there's damage, we'll deal with it then. But maybe you should plant your tree a little bit further away. Maybe I should dig a little bit further away, because that seems like good sense to avoid a problem. Because you don't really want to go to court. You don't really want to have to deal with damages. All right, I think we just have one last Mishnah, because for some reason this didn't print Mishnah 13 and 14. So I don't think we would have had time for them tonight anyway, so let's go ahead and do Mishnah 12.
A person may not plant a tree near another's field unless it is 4 cubits away, no matter whether it be a vine or any other kind of tree.
All right, so now we're not talking about a cistern, no tank. We're talking about field and tree. So what's wrong with my tree near your field?
And so Rabbi, still thinking about the last one.
Yeah.
So what can plan then? What was Rabbi Yossi say that?
You can plant your tree and I can dig my cistern and we're fine, because it's your property, my property, and we're not causing any damage yet. Your tree is just a little tree, right? It doesn't have any roots at all. So therefore, it's fine. And if there's a problem later, then we'll deal with it. Now, it's still a good idea to follow the guidelines of distances, but it's your property and my property, we can handle it. All right, so what's wrong now with a tree near my field? The roots again. Now, we don't think about this because most of us maybe aren't big gardeners, but if you're using a plow, right, the metal thing behind the cow going through the ground, making the grooves that you're going to put the seeds into, if there's a root, then your plow is going to hit that. It might break it, or at the very worst, or at the very least, it's going to be hard to use your field because there are these roots in the middle of my field. So therefore, your tree has to be a reasonable distance away, 6 feet away from my field, so that your roots are not likely to cause any trouble for me using my field. Okay, part A.
If there was a wall between each may plant up to the wall on either side.
Right, but if there's a wall, then we are saying this is your property, this is my property. We can plant right up against that wall, and then part B will deal with the consequences.
If its roots enter within the other's property, the other may cut them away to the depth of 3 handbreadths, so that they shall not hinder the plow. All
right, so for a foot deep, right, about that deep, if I am cutting through my field and I see roots from your tree, I get my axe and I can chop those roots and clear it out. Now, I can only go down this far. I can't like dig down 10 feet and get the rest of the roots. I can only go down this far, but I can clear that out so that my plow can work without any trouble. So yes.
If you kill the tree because you cut part of the roots,
I'm allowed to do this. So yes, if I
survive.
Well, usually for this amount of roots, because it's only on one side of the tree and it has all the rest, and you're only taking off the surface level of the roots, it shouldn't kill the tree. But technically, if it does die and you did only take as deep as you were supposed to, that's just the consequence of being that close to someone else's property.
so
What was I supposed to do? Not use my field?
So how deep are you allowed to?
3 tfachim, which is about a foot.
1 foot.
So what is that, like 30 centimeters? About like that.
Foot of a person, more or less.
Depends on the person. Some people have very small feet. All right, and then part I.
If he dug a cistern, trench, or cave, he may cut them away as far down as he digs, and the wood shall belong to him.
All right, and again, if I do need to use my property, and I start digging and I find roots from your tree, and I really do need to go down because this is what I want to plant here or what I want to make here, I can cut the roots all the way down. Now, only in the distance that I need, right? I shouldn't be like digging under your property to do this. And when I cut it, I get to keep the wood, right?
I mean the roots.
The root wood,
Yes,
exactly.
the root.
As I cut through this with my axe, I take that and now I can use it for firewood or anything else I want to do. Because that wood, because it's from, even though it's your tree, because it's on my property, it belongs to me now when I take it from you. Make sense? Makes sense. All right, we'll leave it there. Again, I apologize. I don't know why the printout didn't do 13 and 14. So we will finish up chapter 2, which is a long chapter. We'll finish up chapter 2 next week.
Can I take this home?
Of course, of course. You're always welcome to take the handouts as long as you promise to bring them back so I don't have to waste more paper to make new ones.
Oh, okay. But
So-
this one I can take.
Yeah, you can keep it. And once we're done with this chapter, you can keep it forever.
Thank you.
Aaron, I didn't see you in my list.
Huh?
I didn't see you in my list for